It's time to think again about death and life, humility and honor, leadership and service, worship and calling. It's time to think again about the role of spiritual friendships, letting go of anxiety and celebrating missions. It is time to think again.
Good to see all of you tonight. Welcome back to TNL, and we're going to be continuing in our series titled Think Again as we're looking through the book of Philippians and seeing everything that Paul would like us to think again about when it comes to how to live out our Christian faith. So tonight we're going to be, if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and turn to Philippians chapter 4, or if you have your journaling Bibles, you can go to chapter 4. We're going to be looking at actually one of my favorite passages in the New Testament tonight. But before we get there, let me tell you a story. So several years ago, there was a couple who were here in New Haven, Josh and Alyssa Harris. And Josh was a Yale Divinity student, and with his wife Alyssa, they both actually got really involved in Yale Chi Alpha in the early days of Yale Chi Alpha, and we got to know them really well and had a wonderful time just spending time with them over the years that they were here. But I can remember in like the first or second year they were here, I said to Alyssa, "How do you feel about running a half marathon?" And she was like, "Well, I've never run a 5K, so I don't know about a half marathon." But I was like, "No, it's going to be fine. I've done it a couple times. We can train. It'll be great." And so I was able to talk her into doing it with me. So the marathon itself was going to be the last weekend in April, but both of us knew that it was going to take some time for us to be ready and that we were going to have to train for a while. So for about 20 weeks, every week, Alyssa and I would get together and we would run together. And I can tell you there were many weeks, especially through the winter months, when we just wanted to get bagels and coffee and not run at all. But we persevered most weeks and we got out there. And actually, as the weeks went on, the runs got longer and it just gave us more and more time to get to know each other and to share a lot about what God was doing in our lives. And it just was a really cool time. Well, it comes up that it's the night before the race at the end of April. And I look online to just make sure we've got all the details covered. And I read that the race that we had chosen actually had the third highest number of hills of all half marathons in the state of Connecticut. Now, I had no idea what this meant. Are there a lot of hills in Connecticut? I had no idea. We were about to find out. But the next day, Alyssa and I show up with a little bit of trepidation, but we get ready. We're at the starting block, the bell rings and we're off. And it was going pretty well. I mean, about a quarter of the way in, halfway in, all the professionals that run these races all the time had already been to the halfway point and were on their way back. So that was kind of demoralizing, but we made it, we kept going, and 13.2 miles later, we were able to cross that finish line. But in between the starting bell and the finish block, I can promise you a lot happened. I mean, I can remember towards the beginning of the race, we came around a bend, and we were coming off a trail onto a road, and as we looked in front of us, the road went up a hill as far as the eye could see. We couldn't see anything on the other side. And I can remember we both just moaned out loud, but we kept running. And that was when we discovered we were going to be running hills for the next couple hours. It was, guess what? There are a lot of hills in Connecticut. And so we did that for a couple hours. But on a more serious note, the other thing that I didn't realize at the time was that I was actually struggling with pretty severe anemia. And I hadn't been diagnosed yet, but it would take a real physical toll on me if I had too much exercise, and especially if I had too little energy and too little food. So what I thought was happening was that I was having my blood sugar was dropping out. And when that would happen, I would suddenly feel overwhelmed with exhaustion and I would begin to shake. And I needed to have either something to eat, something like some kind of protein, or even just a little bit of sugar, something to drink, and then usually I could stabilize and then be okay. Well, I can remember that halfway through the race, that happened. Alyssa and I are literally almost halfway out, and we find ourselves kind of in the middle of a field. And there's no one behind us. There's no one in front of us. There's not even a porta potty. There's not even like one of those little tables that has all the little free cups of water you can grab when you're running past. There was just nothing. And all of a sudden we're standing there and I'm shaking and I don't know what to do. Well, Thankfully, at the very beginning of the race, some people who had organized the event were passing out some free protein bars, just little protein bars. And for some reason, Alyssa and I both grabbed several. It was the only thing we had on us. We didn't have water bottles, nothing else except these protein bars. But we were able to eat them, and I was able to recover, and we continued on in the race. Now, that was probably the most intense moment for me, for sure. I mean, there were other moments that we struggled, though, for the other back half of that race. You know, I can remember, especially in the last quarter mile or half mile, we thought we were just done for. And I think it's because we could see the finish line. I mean, already we'd had to take a couple breaks where we just walked for a minute. But I can remember in those last few moments, we would just call out each other's names. I can remember we would just say, Sarah, Alyssa, kind of back and forth, like, don't give up, keep running, keep running. And thankfully, we were able to make it to the end. Well, last week, I realized that we are halfway through a different kind of race. Last week marked 1 year since we have met in person as Yale Chi Alpha for a worship service like TNL. In fact, for some of you, it's been an entire year since you've met in person for core group. And I know I'm going to say all of you, core group is such a wonderful, special time. And I'm so glad that we've still been able to do that online. But I know we all feel the loss of not being able to be together in person. And when I realized that, I realized the story I just told you is just a smaller picture of what we've all been going through. You know, we're halfway through this race. And I think some of us are wondering how long it's going to last. And maybe even if there's anything that good that could come from it. And sometimes I think think to ourselves, I'm just tired of talking about it. I'm tired of it absorbing my life. And so, you know, just like when we were in the race, I think what we discover in moments like these is that when you feel vulnerable or you feel like there's chaos around you, you reach out for different things to grab to try to steady yourself. But in those moments, what you also discover is that some things are worth fighting for more than others. You know, when Alyssa and I were running that race, there were other things that I needed, other things that felt weak. You know, my feet didn't feel good. Maybe I needed new shoes. I don't know. But what was essential, the thing worth fighting for in that moment, was food, and the right kind of food. And so tonight, as we're halfway through this race, some of you may feel like you are standing all alone in the middle of a field. You might feel isolated or stretched thin. And if it isn't a result of COVID and all the ramifications that have come from that, maybe it's just from some other situation in your life where you might feel stretched thin, or you might have a close friend or family member who feels that way. But as we come into chapter 4 of Philippians tonight, what we're going to see is Paul's going to show us that some things are worth fighting for more than others. So let's read chapter 4, verses 1 through 7 together tonight. This is what it says. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Well, like I said, sometimes in unique situations, when you feel like you're trying to regain control, you might reach out for something to steady yourself. So I don't know what that's been for you this last year, whether it's been something ridiculous or something more meaningful and powerful. But what we're going to see tonight is that Paul speaks to us out of this passage in 3 ways. He wants to help us think again about how we fight for our friends, how we fight for our minds, and how we see the fight of God. So how we fight for our friends, how we fight for our minds, and how we see the fight of God. So let's go ahead and get into it tonight. So what does it mean that Paul says, I want you to think again about how you fight for your friends? Well, let me read verse 1 for you one more time. It says, "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends." Paul loves these people. And we've said that before. They were very close friends. But then through verses 1 through 4, it seems like he really calls some people out. There's these two women, and suddenly he's like, they need to get it together, and everybody needs to help them. And from a cursory glance at this text, it may seem like Paul is saying, there's these two fringe people on the edges of this community. They're a hot mess. Let's get in there and fix this. But as you really look at the community that Paul was speaking to, and you begin to look at the way he's talking about these women, what you discover is that they weren't on the fringe. They were right in the center. These two women were women that Paul endorsed, that he worked alongside with, and he's asking people right in the center of that community to fight for their friendship and to help them fight for each other. Now, why is Paul bringing this up? Well, if you remember when we were back in chapter 2, we saw one of the themes of the book of Philippians, which is unity. And Paul talks about how if you have this conviction that you're brothers and sisters in Christ, and if you're going to be a great community because of that conviction, then you have to follow these convictions all the way through. And that has direct implications of how you live in community. So let's talk about the themes from Philippians, though, for a second, because that'll help us understand what Paul's getting at with community. Two of the strongest themes, one of them is unity, like I said, but the other strong theme in Philippians is holiness. Now think for a minute about how those two interface each other, especially in community. See, because unity is easy if you don't care about holiness. It's easy to chill with your friends if you don't care how anybody behaves. But on the other hand, holiness is easy if you don't care about unity. Because anytime anybody disagrees with you or disappoints you, you can just bail. And as I was studying this passage, I realized that's an exacting account of how we still live. We say things like, I really want community, but then we say things like, well, you do you. We don't touch each other. We're not involved in each other's lives. Or we say we want community, but then when push comes to shove, we bail or we cancel people. We just jump out. And so relationally, we live in this tension of either total affirmation or total withdrawal. And we don't know sometimes how to find that middle balance. But what Paul is trying to lead us to is to think again about our real communities and to think about what it means for us to be responsible to each other. What do I mean by that? Well, I think that Paul lived by this principle. I think that Paul believed that he was not responsible for others, in the sense that he was not responsible for their behaviors. He was not responsible for their choices. They had to own their choices and their behavior. But because of the way that Christ humbled himself, like we saw in chapter 2, and he came down the cross of humility, and he bore responsibility to us, that we should do the same thing. So Paul is saying, you are not responsible for each other, for every single action, but you should be responsible to each other. You have to shoulder each other's burdens. You have to care. You have to get involved. When I was in the middle of that race, and Alyssa and I were standing in the middle of that field, Alyssa could have very easily turned to me and said, well, good luck with that. I will see you at the end of the race, right? No, but she didn't. And on the other hand, she also didn't have medical advice. She couldn't exactly diagnose what was going on with me in that moment. But sometimes shouldering the burden for somebody else isn't necessarily having all the answers, but it's also not bailing either. It's just being in proximity and being willing to have the deep and honest conversations about what's going on in your life, and then sharing your own life back and giving and receiving in who you are and letting that strengthen who you are. And can I just encourage you that that is one of the strongest ways that you will build your faith. Recently I've been reading a lot about the life of Augustine, and what has really amazed me is that this great thinker, this great philosopher, who a lot of people have leaned on for many, many years when it comes to Christian theology, when he tells his own story, what he doesn't say, well, I was interested in Christianity, and so I just read up on it a bunch, and I looked at all the details and the facts, and I thought, yep, Christianity is for me. I mean, even somebody like Augustine, who wanted to be challenged intellectually, will say that his life was littered with people who not only had very strong convictions about what they believed intellectually about who Jesus was, but they were living it out. They were shouldering each other's burdens. And it demonstrated for him that Christianity was real. You know, you can't really know who you are until you see your life reflected in your friend. And they can't really understand who they are until they see their life reflected in yours. So my encouragement for you tonight, and I think this is what Paul would say too, is that if you feel isolated and alone in the middle of a field, or if you ever get to a point when you feel like that, it is time to fight for your friends and fight for those relationships that will lead you back to God, or to go out and fight for the friends that need to be led back to God. But secondly, fight for your mind. Fight for your mind. Let me read you verses 6 and 7. It says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." You know, when you're standing out alone in the middle of a field, isolated and unprepared, it can be hard to think straight. And that's what anxiety feels like. Sometimes it's like when you can't think straight. And you know, for centuries, people have tried to understand, how do I tap into peace and joy, if that is a solve for anxiety. And you know, the philosophical schools during Paul's time, when he was writing this, believed that you could just look within and you could find peace and joy. And we still do that. We still tell people that all you need to do to find what you need to survive in this life is to look within and peel back the layers of your soul. And at some point you'll hit bedrock and just discover, you know, all along you had peace and joy. It just had to be tapped into or actualized. And while that's one way I think we look at discovering something like peace and joy, I think the other way that we go about it is assuming that peace and joy are just superficial emotions that are on the surface of our lives, and that if we eliminate anything that would cause distraction or discomfort or annoyance or frustration, then we'll somehow be able to grab onto those feelings. And so we do one of those two things. We either dig within, thinking we'll hit bedrock and discover it like lost treasure, or we think, well, let me just erase everything that's bothering me and giving me conflict or just annoying me, and then I'll have peace and joy. But what Paul is saying is that neither one of those things work. Instead of looking in or just trying to eliminate things, you need to look up to God and submit every single day your anxieties to Him, and He will gift you joy and peace that comes from Him and has power to change your heart and your mind, a power that you don't have within yourself. But you know, every once in a while when I'm talking about this, I wonder if there's some person sitting here in my square on the TV that would hear something like that and think, you know, that sounds right, but it feels too simple. You know, maybe you'd think to yourself, like, I feel like I have tried that. I feel like I have tried to pray about things in the past, but anxiety still haunts me. And I think there's two things you need to hear. One is you need to just remember how important it is to feed yourself the right things, right? So let's go back to the race. You know, after I was able to eat those protein bars and study myself, you know, we were able to get through the back half of the race, but it wasn't the last time we had to feed ourselves. We did pass by the tables that had water, but the other thing that they gave you to eat, not just the protein bars, they gave you these, it was like a yogurt tube with solidified Gatorade in it. And if you ate that, it gave you like this burst of energy. And so we did that even though it was disgusting, right? But it gave us the right energy. But what if during the race, I had looked at the table, Alyssa and I had looked at the table, and it had been covered in my favorite pastries, like chocolate cake, cheese danishes, orange scones. I mean, can you imagine being 10 miles into a race and eating a huge slice of chocolate cake, right? You know that you can't do that something really bad might happen to you if you do something like that at that point. And the truth is, we can sometimes know that in physical ways and how it has ramifications on our life. But what we need to understand is that it's the same spiritually. what we feed ourselves, subconsciously, the things that we look at on our phone, the things that we get lost in the evening, the things that we allow to make a deep impression on our lives, if they're not coming from the source of God himself, and if we're giving ourselves a disproportionate input of stuff from the world that is not glorifying God, then we will make ourselves sick. It's the wrong kind of food, and it won't give joy and peace. And when we begin to eat the right things and absorb ourselves to the right things, things do begin to change. But also, it's what Paul says. It's every single day just submitting your anxieties to God over and over again, believing and trusting that he can do something. And as simple as that sounds, it is actually a profoundly simple biblical truth that God will begin to change your heart and your mind. You know, I don't know if you were a kid like this, but there are two kids in my house that love to see how tall they're getting. And so they want to be measured all the time on the door frame. And you can measure a kid like 5 days a week and nothing will change, right? And then all of a sudden 2 months go by and you measure that kid and they've grown 2 inches. You know, that's the way it is with our spiritual lives. You can feel like you're doing something very simple, and sometimes it may not feel like it's having a huge impact or a huge change, but you'll get to a moment and suddenly you'll think, I responded to that differently than I did last semester. I responded that differently than I did last Christmas, or whatever it was, whatever mile marker it is that you look at. And what you need to be encouraged by is that you can not only fight for your mind, but God is fighting for your mind when you submit those things to him. Which brings me to the last final thing, just briefly, that you need to see the fight of God. Let me read verse 7 for you again. It says, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus." You know, when you are standing out alone in the middle of a field, isolated and unprepared, where do you see God in that moment? Do you see him as with you, like the same way that Alyssa was with me? Or do you feel like God is just watching you, just observing you, just waiting to see if you have the stuff to take it? You know, what Paul is saying here is that even if you don't feel the presence of God, God is right here. In fact, like I said, in chapter 2, we read that Christ came down the ladder in humility to be present with us. But he's not only present with us, he guards us. I mean, think about a security detail that might be standing outside the building of somebody very important. If a security detail is standing outside the building, they're not constantly turned around looking in the windows, making sure whoever important inside is getting their coffee or if they're okay. They're constantly focused outside. They're constantly looking for any dangers that might be coming and making everyone else aware when the danger approaches. That's what it means for God to be present, and that's what it means for him to guard you. When he comes into your life, it's not a nebulous thing that never makes a direct impact, but he's right there. He's present, and he's guarding you. He's looking for the danger. He's fighting for you. So tonight, we're going to take a moment to reflect and pray before we're finished, but I just want to encourage you with those 3 things. You know, if right now you feel like you're standing alone in the middle of a field, isolated and unprepared, you need to see that it's time to fight for your friends. Go and allow your friends to fight for you, but go and fight for them too. But also fight for your mind. Don't give up because you would say, well, I just haven't felt it yet. But every day, with gratitude, in prayer, submit yourself to God. And then what you'll discover is that God is fighting for you, because the peace of God that guards your heart and mind and transcends everything that you understand will come and be alive in your life. So considering those 3 things tonight, let's just take a moment to pray. And I'm going to ask that God would speak to you and maybe give you some direction from what you should do from this night to be able to respond.